now that we've gone over how I find references and how I find tutorials, now we're on the actual drawing stage. Now we're at the part of the video where I showcase my studies and I showcase what notes I take and what focus I hone in on, what type of focus I use and how I use that focus on certain parts of the drawing or certain parts of the reference image, right? So I have the video sped up by about, I don't know, 400, 500%. And I slowed it down so you can see, but I'm just going to be pausing and explaining what particular area I'm looking at and what I'm thinking at the time, because I wrote down my notes as well. So here we have this reference images of a van taken from 3 separate areas, right? So immediately I block in the van. That's one thing you should always do, is block it in. I draw some perspective lines. I take note of how the perspective is, and then I proceed with the drawing, right? One thing I also do is, since we're drawing in perspective, I put in these X's to find the true center. This is a technique you can use to find the true center on any box in perspective. You take the corners, connect them together, and then draw a line straight down the middle. So I even put down my notes right here. Start with the box, divide using X to find the perspective. And then after that, what I do is I find what the correlation is, or what areas represent what in terms of the box. So I see that in the middle, this window would be in perspective in the middle somewhat, and so would the tire be. And I already started outlining the body. So what I'm doing is I'm using the main shape first, and then I'm putting in the details. You want to start with a block, and then you want to chisel that block down until you get the details right. I'm putting in the details, right? Putting in the doors. And so I started with an overall shape, and then I chiseled that shape down until I got what was expected of the drawing. And sure, it's messy, sure, it's not clean, but you have to get messy and you have to get dirty in order to get to the cleaner parts. Same thing here. I block it out. Right here, I write down subdivide box again to find the tire. Keep everything lined up according to perspective. I don't remember what I mean by subdivide box again to find tire. I think I'm talking about how this creates a little box right here, and then you subdivide it again. I redraw it. Sometimes I put in the details, sometimes I put in the overall shape. Most of the time I put in the overall shape. I do a little bit mix of both, which is probably a bad habit of mine that I need to fix. So since we're looking at it from above, I draw it from the box from above, right? And we always start with boxes. So right here, I showcase the fact that tires in perspective set at an angle. A circle in perspective is always an oval. So I demonstrate that a circle just with no perspective applied is a circle, but then I create a 2-point perspective here, and I subdivide it with the X technique that I showed in this one right here. And I show that it's not actually a circle, it becomes an oval. And here I talk about draw the overall body first, and then I have this triangle chart in terms of importance. So the most important is the size. You want to get the size correct. You want to get the box correct, right? The second most important step is the proportion. You want to have things in perspective, and you want to have things appropriate in proportion to each other. And the smallest detail, the smallest and of importance is the details, right? You start with the overall shape and the size first, and then you care about proportions, and then you care about the details last, right? So size, proportion, details. Okay, let me see what I wrote down there. Details are lined up between all car aspects like paint, crevices, etc. Yeah, so that goes in line with the lining up thing. So if my perspective is going this way, then my car needs to go that way as well. And so do my windows, and so does my details. So that one turned out relatively well. This one did not. As you can see, I block it in again. I also want to point out in my first drawing that my perspective wasn't at all correct. It needed to be closer. There was way less space on the top in the picture than there was in the drawing. But that's okay. So for this one, I tried to use a tip I took from a YouTube video, which was separate vehicle into 2 blocks. One for the lower block, which by lower I mean the hood or the actual lower body of the car, and then a second block for the hood. And already I can see that I didn't get the perspective right. And instead I get the overall shape, but then I lose myself in the details. And since my base is flawed, the rest of the image is flawed as well. I have a lot of trouble drawing these smaller cars. I have a better process, and I just do better drawing the bigger cars than I do the smaller cars. So I try to erase it, but nothing works because I messed up the foundation. So then this is an important step that I like to do. Sometimes I know what's wrong and I don't write any notes, but most of the time when I want to review what I knew was wrong, I just I write down what went wrong. So first off, wrong perspective. Then my second is need to differentiate between when to use boxes and when to round out those boxes, which was a problem in this drawing in particular. So then I also write down I underestimated how much space the bumper takes up, and that's a reoccurring problem through all my drawings in this month. Is I don't really understand the bumper system and the actual amount of space that cars take up. And my main gripe right here, which I tried to work on this entire month, is be looser. So right here I write down mirror, windows, and perspective are more curved. So and then I draw my example. So instead of just solely writing down what I want, I also draw myself examples. So I'm showing here that in this perspective, the windows in this picture are actually more curved and rounded, right, compared to the front one. So these side windows are more curved and rounded and receding in space than the front window. That's another important thing, is I differentiate what areas of notes there is, and I draw my notes, I block it out, and I write down what's wrong. And that's going to be a common theme. So sometimes I didn't record what I drew, and sometimes I didn't even write any notes at all. But right here, I drew this Japanese Suzuki truck, and it turned out relatively well. Messed around with some shading and stuff, and I wrote down, use the same principle of tires and wheels for headlights, and I showcase this wheel in non-perspective and this wheel in perspective. And like I said, any circle in perspective is always an oval. So I'm basically telling myself that I messed up on the headlights here, and that I should take more care into creating them to be more in line with perspective, more in line with ovals than actual circles. And we're gonna move on. Hopefully. There we go. So here's another area of which I messed up on. So I do the same thing like I did with the first car, which is I block it out into 2 blocks. But the problem is I also messed up the perspective on this one. The box is too close to the imaginary horizon line that I've set myself. It's too close up. It needs to be lower so I can see more of the top. Once again, I misjudged the length, and you'll see me do that a lot. I'll create a box for myself, and then I'll second guess myself, and I'll draw outside the box. So this was just not very good. I was not having a good day for drawing, and I tried to fix it. I'm just not really good with drawing these smaller, sleeker cars. I like drawing the trucks and the bigger cars. Like I said before, if the foundation sucks, no amount of erasing and soft erasing will help. It'll just suck. That's the main takeaway here. And sometimes I'm having good days, sometimes I'm having bad. So I put in what's wrong, what went wrong. I instantly knew that the perspective was wrong. The wheels, the relationship of objects to each other. So what I mean by that is the size of the objects, the proportion, like I showed in that triangle chart, the proportion wasn't correct, and the wheels weren't in line with each other. So naturally, it's not gonna look good as a result, no matter how many times I redraw it. Here's another, I would say, more successful than the smaller cars. I divide it into 2 blocks. I do some perspective. And right here, I showcase another technique for drawing cars, and learning how to gauge the distance is using the size of the tires. So I write down using tires as measurement in perspective as well as non-perspective. So that's a technique artists use, is you just take the size of the wheel and you duplicate it, or you estimate how big the wheel is to see where the wheels would take place in perspective as well as in non-perspective. So instantly, I know that the box is incorrect. It's a square. I should have made it a rectangle. And I saw that after I did all that stuff. So I'm like, okay, let's soft erase. Let's see if we can make it a little wider. Let's make some of the details line up more. I'm working hard. The tires I was really struggling with early on. I still struggle with them. But yeah, early on, I did not really understand. So I write down my sense of planning is messed up due to unfamiliarity, because I didn't really draw any big vehicles after the first one. So right there, I write down observe more and draw less. Even though I did observe that the rectangle was correct in the boxing out aspect, I didn't do that when I was first doing the drawing, right? So, you know, maybe I need to take more time observing and less time drawing. So this is, I think the same day. The perspective is wrong. It looks like an ugly abomination, right? The wheels were correct in terms of the perspective, but the details, I didn't really understand how the bumper works. And the box was wrong, the perspective was wrong, the length was wrong. Everything was wrong about this one. I just wrote IDK because I knew it was such a failure. And I knew that. So here, I got bored of drawing cars and standard perspective. I decided to give different types of cars and different areas of cars more of a showcase. I'm drawing a truck from behind. So this is a great exercise for perspective as well as learning to draw different body types of cars. Erase, erase, erase. At this point, I started using a pencil more instead of using the pen. That was very important. Do some shading. And there's nothing much to say about that one. Nothing much to say. I messed up the perspective of these things. Shading could have been better. Shading with a pencil, I don't like compared to a pen or an ink brush. So if I was going over these in ink again, it'd probably look better. It's okay. We're all learning. I don't have much to say here. Those went smoothly, I would say, compared to the last two failures. This one I messed up on. It's a front view drawing. I haven't drawn a front view car yet. The main problem with this one was the proportions. I made the front not relate in perspective, as well as I didn't really dedicate any time to the hood or the mirrors, so it kind of looks like an earless car without the mirrors, right? And the spaces, I didn't really line them up at all, or just forgoed any type of details. This was when I started understanding how to draw cars in terms of a looseness and in terms of gesture. Right here, you can't really tell because of the sped up version, but I really embraced the sketch fast and loose with this car, and it's easier to do with sidecars than it is with front view and other types of views, right? Because you don't have to deal with perspective, you just have to deal with lining up things. But I write down sketching fast and loose seems to be best, especially for cars. I write down focus on overall shape, perspective, then details. Fast and loose requires less planning and energy and contributes to the flow / motion of cars. So that's the one thing I don't really like about drawing cars, is that it requires you to be more stiff, and in order to introduce more energy and life to these cars, you need to be looser, and that's what I was missing in my earlier drawings. What did I write down at the end there? So I showcased that it's a slope. Right? I'm using contours. I write down that it's better to overestimate the size of the car because that can be fixed later than it'd be too small. This was a drawing I did when I wasn't recording. Not that great, but it's a different type of shape, and it's a different type of perspective, right? So those are important as well. The wheels I started to get a hang of a little bit more. The different types of shapes. Cars use a lot of different shapes and a lot of funky things that you don't normally use in, human body drawing and maybe flower drawing or things like that. So it's more mechanical. It requires more understanding of shapes and complexity of mechanics than anything else. Don't really have much to say about this one. I got the perspective right, but the detailing was really not great. So right here, I showcase that. I'll talk about it when I'm done with this one. So I start with the wheels and then I do the body. I don't know if that's the correct way to do it. Move them around too much. I feel like I did this one pretty good. Maybe it was a little bit too short lengthwise, but the details were really, really good on this one. I feel, even for a pencil drawing where it's, as chaotic and loose and things like that. And I went over and I shaded the top one. It looked a little bit better with the shading. So I write down, would be helpful to break down individual vehicle parts to understand how they work. And that's true if you don't understand how a certain mechanic of a car or a certain body part, when it comes to a body, how it works. You want to break it down step by step, and you really want to understand how it works before you tackle on to the bigger, more complex subjects. And then I write down, not every detail of the tires, machinery, etc. needs to be drawn. Focus on shape and perspective first. So there's a common theme. Details can ruin the overall picture, especially in sketch. Let me see. I can't really. I was perfectly legible when I was writing it down. Details can ruin the overall picture because of your lack of knowledge of the machine. So sometimes it's better to forego details for a much cleaner, more simpler drawing. You don't need to draw everything, right? I had trouble drawing the scooter. I had the perspective kind of correct, but the proportion was off as well. So I just kind of, this one I kind of refined over and over and over again. And I fully embraced pencil drawing instead of using my pen because I felt more looser with the pencil. I had a lot of trouble with that top, like the front part. And then this one, when I was drawing this Jeep, I really embraced how to do like that loose sketching and how proportions work, at least in terms of this car. I measure it out. I tried measuring it out. The wheels, I kind of see, I redraw it. I'm like, man, that kind of sucked. So I got the overall shape, and then I start getting the overall shape of the doors, overall shape of the back, and then the details. Get the correct details on the car, the underside. I write down, was my box wrong? Need to lay out, measure proportions beforehand. So what that means is I just need to, you know, measure like this goes to here, wheels go to here, this piece goes up here, etc., etc. And I really tried my best with this one, with the Jeep right here. Fast and loose, start light and sketchy, then darken / soft erase. My tires are getting better. So it's important to, let me take a drink here. It's important to praise yourself as well as point out your flaws as well. Just do a little bit of shading. Doesn't need to be completely accurate, long as it has energy and flow. And I felt that with this drawing. What did I write down there? Let's see. Doesn't need to be accurate as long as size proportion and the details are more or less quote unquote accurate, right? So this is my first time tackling a different type of perspective, more like a fisheye lens or something like that. So what I did was I tried putting it in a box first, like this panel first before drawing it, so I could get the sense of space. What's wrong with this image I can tell is I didn't make it diagonal enough. I didn't push the perspective enough, which meant the car looked goofy and weird. So I went over it with pencil or with pen, and the pen drawing was absolutely horrendous because it points out the flaws of the underlying drawing. Right, and then I tried to redraw it and I was like, man, I don't know what's wrong. Like I legitimately didn't know what was wrong until I took a step back and re-examined the picture, and I saw that while the perspective was semi-correct, the wheel and the object close to the camera wasn't, which made it a weird amalgamation, fast and loose. So the main takeaway from this one, which is fast and loose, don't worry about shakiness. Energy and gesture, accuracy not needed. Needed a much steeper perspective. Whatever. Pencil sketch will always look better than inked. A second pass through. Understand the idea before the execution. So this one I didn't really understand the idea before I executed it. I write, draw to improve, not impress. This one I did off recording. I reiterate that low to the ground gives me a lot of trouble, and then I tried to draw the hood separately, doing like just a pure outline with no perspective. And I studied like the little symbol right there and the eye curve. So this one was relegated to this one, and then over here I was just messing around with the perspective and the actual shape. So I was breaking it down step by step. So I didn't do very well on this drawing either. This one is another one that I did, I think, right after the sports car. The perspective was entirely wrong. I didn't even do a perspective box for this one. I just drew the panel, and I tried to do a little bit more scenery which as you can see didn't work out as well because the perspective, it wasn't entirely wrong, but I should have started out with a perspective box. The details are mainly what I was trying to draw here, but because there's so much going on, it gets lost in translation. And ultimately it looks worse than if I just stuck to the simple overall shape and structure. This one was a front view of a scooter, some type of motorcycle. And I was really struggling with those flappy bits at the bottom there. The top part I got pretty correct, but overall, overall I think it was fine. It wasn't too bad. But the bottom, like drawing those back details and the machinery at the bottom was giving me the most trouble. It's also hard to convey details on tires without it looking like a complete mess. So maybe I'll have to do some studying on tires as well. I'm not a big fan of drawing cars. They require so much to keep in line. Yeah, I messed up that front part too. Overall, I think it was a decent drawing. So now, this was during the tail end of my studies for July. I decided to take these smaller cars so I could understand the boxy. Since everybody beginner artists are good with sharp edges rather than curves, I'm like, okay, I'll just do sharp edges. This one I got the shape wrong, I believe. I don't think I wrote down any notes for this one. I just kind of did it. I tried to fix the perspective early on. It's easier to fix it early on than to draw everything and then move things around. When I was drawing this one, I kind of started understanding how perspective ties in with the windows. But I think the main draw was the looseness of this sketch rather than the actual details, because the sketch looks fine. This one was a little easier to draw. It's relatively simple. It was more about lining things up than it was about the actual accuracy. So I write down, maybe instead of doing just a perspective box, I draw the actual box and then do the perspective box inside of the original box. And I write down I need to draw more rounded / sloped cars, because in this one the slope on the front window is too high. It's to be lower. So for all three of these, I denote that my looseness was the one that made them look good, not the actual details. So this is an important thing to note. Discard energy, discard accuracy for energy. This one I didn't really like this one at all. But it's a magazine ad. Don't really have any notes for this one. I think I just messed it up. I tried to do what I wrote down earlier, but it didn't really work. Put in some background details. My second pass through wasn't that great either. I got the whole fundamental concept of the hood wrong. The hood and the window is what gave me the most trouble, I think, in this entire month of studying vehicles. I try to save it with some shading and things like that, but ultimately, like I always say, the base is flawed, so the rest of the drawing will be flawed as well. Yeah. Not that great looking. Did I write anything down? Okay. This was my last drawing for the month, which was this perspective. This perspective was very nice, and I feel like I really nailed the perspective, but maybe the exception of the tire. The tire looks a little too big compared to the original photo, and I forgot to draw the back tire there, and I think the driver's side tire, right? And then I tried going over with an inking pen and I messed it up, so I went back to pencil. But I really like the tire that I drew right here and the details on the tire. Like, it's not that great, but it conveys the accuracy, right? shading right here, and then you have the, I feel like I didn't do this very well. Should have been more over here, and then it cuts off the front windshield. But all in all, I think this was a good drawing as well compared to my first, my freshman effort on this type of angle drawing. And I think that's it. Yep. Anyways, that's how I tackle art. The main steps are you block it out, you draw it, you write down what went wrong, you write down what went right, and then you go from there. You always want to write down the things that you got wrong, the things you got right, the things you need to work on, and the things that potentially could be improvements. And you want to write that in the drawing itself. You don't want to just make a mental note of it. Sometimes there are days where you mess up, and sometimes there are days where you're on top of the world when it comes to the drawing. But you always want to write it down, because you always want to look at your thought process, and you always want to look at what you are feeling and what type of improvement you want to look at. Plus, when you look back at your drawing, it'll remind you what could be done. And plus, you draw something, you understand what's wrong, you look at the image, you understand what's wrong, and then you have a third time reinforcing yourself, which is you're writing it down. So you have visual learning as well as you have learning through muscle memory. And so that's how I study digital art, and that's how I've studied digital art for the past 2 years. I'd like to say 2.5, but that first year, that first half, I didn't really take down notes. I just spammed images and drawings over and over again. I didn't really understand, and that really affected my drawing. As soon as I started taking down notes and I started including examples, and I'd even make images, I'd take images, I'd download them, and I'd go over them in pencil, and I would understand what went wrong and what could be improved. That's when I started really hitting my strides as an artist. So thank you for watching. I hope this video will help anyone struggling with art, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for watching.